It's a procedure. Oh, we recording? All right.
Okay.
We've got one more minute, so it'll be fine. And then we'll still just only informally start in about 1 minute. Give people a chance to grab their food, log in, and then get settled in. Marshall? All right, people are mailing in, grabbing the food and logging in. We'll get formally started in maybe about 3-4 minutes. Before we do though, we've actually grateful to have two speakers with us today and very complimentary topics on very dynamic subjects. But first, let's get to them, at least one of them first. Youssef, do you want to just tell us a little about yourself? Where were you born? Where'd you grow up? How'd you end up here? You probably could have worked on easier things than what you're studying.
Yeah, so I lived, as a fun fact, I lived in more than 12 cities throughout my life. I was born actually in Egypt, but I lived in Kuwait, and then much of the rest of my life I have spent in Canada. So, so this is where I did my undergrad, and it really had nothing to do with AI, unless I got working with data and finding it's, why is healthcare so messy? And this was kind of like my kind of like insight to wanted to learn more about informatics and how it is being used for machine learning, and that was prompted me to come to Stanford to see what people in AI are doing and learn about where it fails and how things are working. And yeah, and then I started having interest in model development, having done some training of that as well, do some of the ethical uses for that. So I feel my interest has broadened based on my journey and where I live and how things has moved. Yeah.
What was your undergrad studies in then?
Health sciences, so exercise physiology.
Okay, so health related. So you want to do something health related all along, but then you realize you can't escape it. I started to think of everything, or is that what it was? Or
yeah, I was like a very bench person doing a lot of things with mitochondria powerhouse and just thinking how like people who do exercise, how do their health differ from people who don't do, what are athletes. And that was just like, I was very good getting at the molecular level, but then I'm starting to realize that, when you go to the public, it's actually social behavior and behavioral management is the problem to get people to exercise. That was okay. So we need to study some of that social behavior as well. And then this is where I kind of, working with data that's mental health and as well as clinical, there's discrepancies, it's hard to link. And so this was very fascinating as a problem, it's very more messy than you would think it is in real life.
Great, well, definitely a lot of rich things to dive into. I think we can more or less get started. Still some people logging in and grab food, but I think we've got enough of a quorum, and I can't wait to hear more from Awad. Take it away.
So I think I wanted to provide some context on why we did actually study organizational readiness at Stanford AIMI. So I'm a research fellow at the Stanford AIMI Center, which is down Porter Drive. And I think a common interest between me and my mentor was clinical data, ethics of clinical data sharing. And I wanted to start with a top-based question, which I think many of the people would know. But can you take a guess at what are the top 3 states from which data is coming? C, right? So fact is that 70% of the data that's coming comes from 3 states, Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania. But also we know that a lot of the existing public data sets, even though they're very helpful for a lot of the innovations that have happened in machine learning and health, they are not generalizable to the general context because they are not representative of the general population. And so we know that bias in algorithms is reflected because of the bias in the data sets. And even for foundational models, we also still see that having vision of the data and understanding biases in the data itself is really important to understand how the model is likely to perform. And so the motivation here was, AIMI Center is a very big, have a huge interest in releasing public data sets since Chest Expert and many other data sets. And so one of the motivation was, we know that the lack of diverse public data sets is a barrier. How can we understand the factors that are shaping data release, as well as what makes great data set for machine learning. So the Stanford AIMI Center received the grant from the Gordon Bettimore Foundation, and it was about how can we make data accessible as a public good, realizing that once clinical data has fulfilled its mission, we can really leverage clinical data to build our AI and ML algorithms. So the goal for my talk and my colleague Madlana is maybe to provide a high overview picture of what are the barriers related to having AI-ready data set for machine learning. I'm going to focus on what makes organizations motivated to share or not share. And my colleague Madlana is going to focus on what actually characterizes and makes from the machine learning perspectives data sets AI-ready or so-called good data sets. And the impact of our work has informed the AIMI dataset index. So we developed an index that collects, the public data set that exists. And this was meant for more to be a pointing direction and a community resource for people to get started where to find public data sets that they can use for machine learning. So learning objectives is you should come out of this, hopefully of this talk, knowing, what are the current gap and limitations, which many of us know about the existing public health data set, but more of so to define what are organizational factors in your context or around it can be influencing the sharing practices of the health data, and then to be able to apply the framework that my colleague Madlana is going to talk about to assess whether the quality of what is the quality of the data sets you're working with. So this research was recently published end of last year in JAMA Network Open, and I'm going to come into why I really wanted to focus on organizational factors. So when I moved into this space and I looked at data sets, I was looking in the literature on why really there will be gaps. And if you think about the data should flow from patients to health systems where it get acquired, data get to be curated, and then it's used by developers. And ideally, we have a flow of data that gets the AI algorithms to be developed and go back to the hospital system and to the patient to benefit that. But if you actually examine the patterns and trends, you would find that actually data is not flowing in that pipeline in a streamlined manner, but people are having backthroughs or secondary routes towards getting data. So in this research, we wanted to focus at health systems and health sectors, organizations in the health sectors that we know are powerful players for controlling for data, and understand what are their general practices, what motivates them to share data or not share data. And this research was very important because it was surprisingly to find actually, despite organizational network analysis is a common topic in business, it actually has zero or no publications in healthcare about what actually shapes the organization's behavior in the health ecosystem. And the main components, what are the factors that shape that? And the reason it's important because it allows you to understand that if you have some networks that are energizers, for example, these networks are almost multiplier. They share data and they empower other organizations to share. If you have someone who's a challenger, they can be controlling for the data, not actually allowing the release of that data. And so our research questions really focused on four main components. What are the motivations? What motivates organizations to share data? What is the facilitators in their context that makes data sharing happen? What are the barriers that makes it happen or not happen? And within successful organizations that had shared data, what really distinguished them from organizations that are not able to share data? Because there's limited research on that, we took a case study qualitative research approach where we identified a list of more than 50 organizations, and we identified across the academic, government, nonprofit, and private sector, and we invited many of those organizations, and based on the response rate, we selected in interviews or cases within each of those four sectors to study really their data sharing behavior. We collected both qualitative and quantitative data. This included, what is the role of the people working and we're interviewing, what type of data sharing they're doing, and qualitative interviews was the major to answer the four questions I mentioned earlier. And I have to say that we did the iterative data analysis, but was also very helpful is through the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and through the AIMI Center, we had an external expert advisory board, which represented people who are involved across the nation in AI development and academic initiatives, and they were giving us feedback on our design, development, and analysis. So I decided not to go into much more details on the methods, but really to get into the meat of the paper. So within the interviews we conducted a total of 27 interviews, and this spanned 18 unique organizations, 6 in academic organizations. So academic were more likely to accept invitations, government 4 case studies, nonprofit 6, and private was the most challenging to get interviews. These were the type, because we're focusing on organizational readiness, we wanted to focus on people who have responsibilities towards either allowing data to share or setting policies or building infrastructure. And so most of the people we talked to were in the C-suite of, they're either having roles to kind of help facilitate, build infrastructure, help govern data, or help, with establishing processes for data sharing. I'm going to give the key takeaways from the findings, which is, if you were to walk away with something is, you need to know that organizational motivation, which is not surprising, is going to vary based on the sector. And you need to know that the process of data sharing is really burdensome, which I don't need to tell this audience about. I imagine everyone knows. But the common theme of we need to share data for the public good is really not sufficient. And if you don't provide incentives within your ecosystem, it's unlikely that organizations are going to collaborate to share data. So this is the framework of really what we came about after we analyzed all of the interviews and we really looked at what really makes organizations share data. Number one was really the alignment in organizational mission and data sharing priorities. So you could look at some academic organizations and you would find that by alignment, you would see that the leadership is for example, having precision medicine or digital health as part of their mission. So investing in the infrastructure and supporting things related to the infrastructure for data sharing and development of this research reputation was important. Therefore, they were likely to allow for support and resources to be allocated. And when this alignment happened, you could see that there is potential for capabilities. This is one quote from one of the interviewees we interviewed, and it says that government organizations and academic ultimately have the good of the public in mind. That is the mission. For academic, the calculation is even more intense because we are meant to be a neutral entity that evaluates science and medicine in a way that isn't biased by profit. But put that aside, the principles of our mission and nonprofit status, I think, really do guide us. And so that's why we can put governance in place that prioritizes ethics over profit. So this motivation is going to be different across other sectors. And so this was one of the key features that distinguished some of the behaviors of organizations in the academic and government sectors. So there was 3 factors that really shaped the motivation for data sharing if we are to look across all cases. And these were, first of all, organizations might be interested to share because it's research bring grants and credits. And so this is why people would want to be sharing data for scientific discovery and having that reputation. But also sharing data has come up with organizational reputation. The more people now learn about your data set and it becomes attributed to your name, you become recognized as an organization that shares data. And then you have finances, which is the non-direct route of why people would hold on to data and might sell data, through other routes. The reason you see a spectrum of motivation to share or not to share is because really it's a spectrum, and where is the incentives aligned, you can shape. So an organization, for example, that does not have the infrastructure to share to promote that scientific discovery, if it gets collaborations from other government or other consortium of organizations to support building that infrastructure, it's going to be incentivized to share data. On the other side, and like we know about the governance as a barrier, but really what really blocks many of the organizations to share data is all of the legal and privacy risks concerned with data sharing. And so this sets the barrier bar really high for many organizations. So with that in mind, there comes the capabilities. And with respect to capabilities, we find 4 core concepts that were really important. First, if you want to know whether your organization is likely to share or not, if it's sharing, then you need to look at its infrastructure. You need to look at whether it have the resources to support data sharing and have a governance system that allows for building processes for data to be shared, and then you have people with expertise in informatics, clinical, as well as IT and data science to be contributing to that. But I think again, one of the key highlights was the reason you need investment in resources and capabilities is that aggregating data, clinical data that already you have, to just get it to sharing is really a burdensome process. And if you're trying to think about equitable contributions and other sites, places like Stanford has the capacity to share, but other places might not have the capacity to share. So this code reads that I do think that there are massive differences between sites, and there are some sites that have tons of informatics expertise, lots of faculty, lots of staff, lots of computing power. And for the most part, those sites had no problem getting up and running on their own, at least from a technical perspective. Then there were sites that are really wanted to participate in, but they hadn't participated in anything like this before. They didn't have a bunch of staff and a bunch of graduate students to help out. It was a lot harder to get up and running because they were new to this idea of data sharing. So this refers mostly to small and medium integrated systems where they are not associated with academic centers or do not have enough resources. So integrating them as part of large data sharing initiatives required really supporting them at the infrastructure level to get them to be incentivized. I love this code because this comes from an academic person who have been working on data curation and pulling data in, but the long point is that data sharing has many stop signs, and there's no incentives within our organizations that currently support to remove those stop signs. So you have a lot of barriers to, first of all, if you are the champion in your organization and you want to get data to be shared, you need, first of all, to incentivize the people in your department to be able to contribute to that. You need to take the time to do that. Most of the time, it's a tedious and charitable process. And you need to overcome the regulatory burden of what is the process of sharing and figuring all this out. So there's many points where participants talked about that really let them give up and feel, like it's not worth as much putting that time in. So this is another one where it's talking about data sharing again as an uphill battle. So I'm going to move on to really, as you think about it, what are the main trade-offs between organization readiness for data sharing. So if we are to sum up what are we really seeing, we see that there is facilitators that allow some organizations to be able to share, and there are barriers that prohibit other organizations to be able to share. But the number one factor that determines is, do you have access to the data? If you have access to the data, you have a power advantage. It's the late limiting step in the reaction. And we saw that technical infrastructure and governance definitely were facilitators. And if you don't have them as well, it becomes barriers. So where you are is, does your facilitators, from the barriers you have is likely to lead you to be incentivized to share data. So going back to the concept of organizational network, and if we looked at the ecosystem and understand what is the behavior of the different organizations and the different health in our health ecosystem, this table shows that across sectors, you have the 4 sectors we looked at and the factors that we identify to be influencing data sharing. And you can see with respect to access to data, all of the other sectors do have like a downward arrow indicating that this is a disadvantage for them, and only academic or health centers with clinical resources to see patients have that data access. Another major one was favorable reputation. So nonprofit, academic, and government are likely to have the reputation that they are sharing data for the public good. However, collaborations between private and academic organizations was challenging because that favorable reputation might not be the case all the time. And then I think something we are behind on and industry is far front of is which we, given differences in ethical values, but there is a lot of data sharing processes and risk management strategies and risk management frameworks that they have developed. But across academic, government, nonprofit, we tend to be stuck in the governance process of, how do we evaluate this? We do not really have a risk management framework or tools that really let us evaluate at any point in time requests and proceeds. We just got started on seeing some of this coming out. So if you're to look at the behavior across sectors, you can see that in academia, what really drives data sharing is champions, clinicians, or scientists who really feel the value of taking that onerous component of building and sharing the data. What drives in government is champions or leadership who develop programs that allows for building consortium for data sharing, for incentivizing building that infrastructure across academic organizations. And for nonprofit, it's either part of their mission or not. And private, again, it's a top-down approach. And one of, if it's within their interest, which is, if they need to invest in data, they're likely using data, but it's about whether they have that support top-down to share data or not. So I think this code comes from trusted partnership, and the context behind this code is that within the MEDRIC Society, which is for medical imaging research, and it came during COVID-19, many of the academic hospitals really did have a challenge of sharing their data, but when the ACR and the professional societies acted as data brokers, so they took on the responsibilities of de-identifying the data and curating the data, many of the academic organizations became more incentivized to do that because they had trust that there is a coordinator in between and there is a nonprofit data sharing entity that's going to be providing that. So building trust and finding who's the trusted person within the network is really important. And then there is the risk of unethical practices, which is a major factor contributing to fear about reputation and why academic and organizations might be risk averse towards partnership. And this comes back to the first incentive is that a lot of health systems have difficulties staying afloat. And so getting revenue up is very important. They know that they are sitting on something valuable, which is data, but they cannot do anything with it. If you are Stanford, yes, that works very well. But if you are a small health system that's just trying to get by, that does not have enough understanding of AI algorithm whatsoever. How are you going to make that work? That's just not going to happen. So this comes from industry who are trying to approach health systems that do not really have the resources. I love to end on this quote, which is public good is not enough. So this person said, I'm all for the public good. I love the public good, but I think we need to define public good in ways that are sharper in order for someone, like if you have specific costs attached to making data available, you just can't say believe in public good, capital P, capital G. That's not just going to work. I think Negam would usually says there's no free lunch, but I mean, the concept here is like data. Yeah, and that's the proverb, but I guess really there's a lot of cost associated, and many of the academic organizations really do not have a process to make up for that cost, which makes sense of why they would be doubting to kind of like invest and then share this outside. So just to summarize, organization readiness require both organizations not only to be capable, but more importantly, also to be willing. Organizational motivation for data sharing varies based on organizational priorities, cost for doing this, and the risks associated. We saw that collaborative data sharing consortium was a way to accelerate and integrate a large number of institutions and generate diverse data sets. And we identified that the lack of incentive is a major barrier for data sharing. So if we are to have things to work on, it's how can we work on trust building within organizations? How do we generate incentives within the network that allow people to share? What can we do to minimize barriers within organizations and across for sharing? What's our risk management with respect to governance? And how do we engage some of the under-resourced centers that do not have the infrastructure? with that, I'd like to thank you and happy to take questions if we have time for questions.
We got a few minutes. Alex, team online, do you want to ask your question? Had his hand raised for a while. But maybe talk more broadly. I mean, a lot of stuff happens. I mean, Mark, you can comment out just in science or biology. Eventually, like journals and funding is like, we will not fund you. We will not publish your paper unless you like release your data. And that was clearly a precedent-setting thing that changed a lot of that practice. But in healthcare, it's like, I don't know, it's not my data, it's the hospital's data. I can't just release that. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Maybe Mark, you can follow. Or Mark, you can lead.
No, it's really interesting because in basic science, there's pressure to share data because of the academic value of making the data accessible, and frankly, because there are federal mandates to make the data accessible. The clinical enterprise, not at all. And all the barriers that you identified are real issues. And at the same time, there's no federal mandate. There's no immediate payoff the way there might be in basic science. It really is a very different enterprise.
And I think also like you can see this with respect to, you know, like the NIH policy for data sharing that came up recently. Like there is always, you know, like you need to share your data with there's some exceptions. And so if you can make your case that, oh, my data is risky to share, I can't share my clinical data, you might have a way to get around it. And also like, what is the cost from the grant to be able to kind of like get the data to be de-identified and get out of that? I think when we were interviewing people from Stanford here, we saw that, you know, like they were already starting, you know, like at the library level to look at data sharing repositories within Stanford and building that. But everyone identified that building that infrastructure and resources takes time and money. And so who's going to be putting that as part of their grant time?
This is a bigger ethics philosophic kind of question. Yeah, maybe you mentioned like ethics of like selling data. Like whose data is this? Is it health systems to sell/share, or is it the patient's data? And who's making decisions about what should be done with it?
Yeah, so this is an interesting component where it's actually that, you know, like how people approach it is that once you, and this is why many of the organizations did not want to talk to us about that.
Off the record, once you get off the record.
But I mean, like in general, I think we know that the data is the patient's data, but once it's acquired by the hospital, the owner is really the hospital. And so they get the ability to set the contracts and terms of what they share and not share. And ethics is you're relying on the moral philosophy. But that's also part of why, you know, what's your reputation as an organization really matters, because if you have a high reputation, you're not going to risk that to just share the data, no matter what is that cost, because it's going to come with it.
That's interesting. There's this discussion in this IT meeting. It's like technically IT can like scan all our computers and read all of our emails right now. Just legally they can do that. But they're just like, we will never do that because that would be, people would hate us forever. So even if we technically can, let's not do that.
Like data ownership is an interesting issue. My understanding is that according to US law, whoever paid owns the data. So insurance, and in case self-insured employers have a legal right to all of their employees' data. Very few of them exercise that right, similar to that example you just gave.
Yeah.
And hospitals, whether they own the data or not is questionable. Patients are only entitled to a copy of the data. They do not own data as understood commonly as by property law, as a, you know, you own your house, not a right to live in your house.
Yeah, that is like,
and so it's quite murky actually, and I don't think it has been settled one way or the other. As far as I know, there's no Supreme Court lawsuit on this one. Yet.
But you can withdraw consent for institutions using your own data for research.
For research, but not for billing, not for anything else. So
for research, anybody can retroactively say, I don't want my information as part of this data set. So when it's released, what happens?
I don't
You have
know.
to like figure out some.
but like again, research is a narrow slice of what data get used for.
Right.
And we're talking about data sharing. I didn't hear it was data sharing just for research.
Yes.
Yeah, because you were talking even private entities, nonprofits, all these different groups, right?
So
Little hospital and community hospital down the street. I mean, or something, even them, or what are you thinking?
So I think the main component here that, like nonprofit and people that try to work, like with large academic institutions is that they mentioned that, they learned through the data sharing process and negotiations of it, what battles to pick. So I'm more easy to build collaboration with a medium-sized hospital and to be able to access the data and help them with curation. But if I go to an academic center, they will not be. But the general process is, the reason this is not a barrier is because most of the hospitals and most of the systems have been implementing a policy where patients sign in that their data can be used for research. And so once it's de-identified, many of that, even the UK Biobank, they mentioned that they're just for research and they're not using this data clinically, but you have a way of like getting away with, like a clear consent that this data can be used for research, except if it's for genomics or some sort of specific data set that they require reconsenting.
Interesting. Okay, we can do more follow-up discussion. I want to pass it over to Madalena, and then we'll still have more time to have both on together. Thanks so much, Youssef. Let's see, and then, yeah, stop here so that Madalena can take that thread over.
Hi.
And let's see your slides. You want to go ahead and take away, or first tell us a little bit about yourself. Where were you born? Where'd you grow up? Why are you here?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I grew up in New York City, but then I came to California for college and I just never left. So I worked in immunology for a little bit while transitioning to a career in public health. I really wanted to work at the CDC and the WHO, but after my master's, I had the opportunity to work with the UCSF Healthy Heart Study. So one of the first big data e-cohort studies of their time, like similar to My Heart Counts at Stanford. And I just really got to see the inner workings of managing like 250,000 patients, participants, and the strengths and challenges there. So that really set the stage for my doctoral work at Berkeley, where I looked more into the ethics and equity aspects of digital health research and platforms. So looked at consent, privacy policies, representation. So when I joined Tina's lab as a postdoc, I was really able to further extend some of those learnings for the evaluation of AI. And currently with Tina, I'm working on AI ethics, bias mitigation, and governance. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of overview.
Fantastic. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you in person in another session, but glad to connect with you virtually at least. And then let's go and take it away, and we'll have some space to catch up for Q&A afterwards.
Yeah. I'm actually at Beamer, so if you see me around, say hi. Just had a family emergency today, so I apologize for not being there in person. So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to share our work. This came about 2 years ago with the Stanford AIMI Center and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And it was also recently published in JAMA Network as well. So thank you again to Ala for like the great overview. Just love always like hearing the research again after stepping away from it for a while, and the breakdown of the LEAD project. So just to reiterate, Module 1 is for understanding what is necessary on an organizational level to enable the public sharing of health data sets for machine learning. Whereas Module 2 focuses on when that occurs, how do we make sure the data is high quality and useful for machine learning researchers? So essentially AI ready. And then there is also a Module 3 that we will get into in a little bit. So we know the development of clinical AI solutions requires ample biomedical and health data. And machine learning research has produced many promising diagnostic AI tools across a spectrum of disease areas using this health data. But despite initiatives making data available, models learned from this health data are often not useful, reliable, or fair, suggesting that there are still some shortcomings with these data sets. And this can really stem from a variety of reasons, including a lack of diversity in the data, scarcity of high quality labels, limited clinically relevant annotations, among many other reasons. So we need to better understand how to produce some of these, how to produce high quality health data sets that are AI ready and publicly available. And this in turn can help expedite machine learning discoveries for patient care allow for a more equitable data ecosystem where all can participate and facilitate the responsible secondary use of health data. So for this module, like, there were 3 overarching research questions we wanted to answer. What are the optimal characteristics of data sets that are AI ready or high quality and useful for health and biomedical machine learning research purposes? And to answer this question, we really had to get to the source. So we talked to data set experts, which included those who created data sets and those who use them for machine learning research. And then 2, we wanted to answer what are relevant factors that drive the creation of these AI-ready data sets. And 3, what best practices and recommendations really help guide the development of AI-ready data sets. So to answer these questions, we used the following methodology. First, through purposive sampling, we identified data set experts, so those who were data set creators or machine learning researchers, ideally both. And then we recruited them through email. And then we used a qualitative study design where we gathered participants' basic demographics, their roles and responsibilities, and then interviewed them to see what they considered are high quality data sets or optimal data set characteristics. So from this data, we generated summary statistics and identified relevant themes from the interviews. So out of 93 people that we reached out to, we were able to recruit a total of 20 dataset experts to interview. And table 1 provides some of the aggregate information about their demographics. Most identified as being both dataset creators and involved in machine learning research. They also had experience with many of the stages across the data preparation pipeline. These data experts were also affiliated with the creation or use of a diverse variety of data sets. So some of them you might be familiar with, including Mimic, UK Biobank, All of Us, etc. So there is a really good representation across relevant data set traits. So before we get into the results, I just wanted to show you the diverse variety of data quality frameworks out in the wild. So we compiled many of these to also help with the creation of our framework. So there are some general ones, general data quality ones here, and then ones that are more specific to big data. So as you can see, like toggling between these 2, their dimensions and elements are not always consistent across these frameworks. So it was a really good starting point for us, though, to make sense of our data. So after identifying relevant themes from our data, we worked together as a team to create a framework. So the first component was to define an AI-ready data set. So it's important to note that this data set lives within the health data ecosystem as well. And in terms of defining an AI-ready data set, we found that data set experts considered data sets are high quality, regardless of the machine learning use case, when they are reliable. And reliability means that ultimately the user trusts the data. And these data set experts that we interviewed primarily judged the reliability of a data set based on 4 components, including whether the data is accurate, complete, gathered using consistent methods, and one that was not previously mentioned in other frameworks was whether the data is ethically acquired. So these intrinsic elements are relevant for measuring the AI readiness of a data set. And then next, in defining an AI ready data set, we found that data set experts also consider data sets to be high quality depending on what their machine learning use case was. So 2 themes emerged worth highlighting here was the relevance and ethical implications of the data set. So relevance being the fitness of the data set to the machine learning use case, and ethical implications being the societal impact if the data set were used for specific research. So I just provided some of these quotes. They're also in the paper if you're interested. So there are also contextual elements that are considered when measuring the AI readiness of a data set. So now that we organize the elements of readiness that are most important to data set experts, we also found that they talked about larger drivers that can help enhance the creation of AI ready data sets. So the first of these drivers is dataset availability, which involves whether data sets are open access and not siloed, or locked. And this is a driver because opening up data sets to scrutiny by the public only helps expedite the discovery of any data set shortcomings or limitations. So for example, lack of accuracy or completeness, etc., and hopefully lead to like improving the quality of those data sets. And then making data sets available also allows users to maybe combine relevant data sets to achieve a higher level of readiness for their particular machine learning use case. However, data set availability is difficult to achieve because data remains locked and siloed at specific institutions, as illustrated by this quote here. The expert said, one of the key blockers of doing really state-of-the-art medical research is that there are no public gymongous data sets that people can use or analyze to train really state-of-the-art machine learning stuff. It all has to take place siloed at the institution level. You really get limited by what's available at your specific university. It creates this almost data equity question where some universities with really talented people just can't play in the same game because the data is locked. There's just no way to get that scale of data. And the second driver is data quality standards, where data set experts have expressed that the application and use of data set quality standards and frameworks can really help with enhancing the quality and prolonging the reusability of data sets. But data set experts also mentioned that current standards need to be updated with what matters most to machine learning researchers, as expressed by this participant here as well. There are all these decisions that really matter for machine learning that aren't really systematically captured. Standards matter, so putting things in standard formats, that's really not been very successful. And the third driver is documentation, where transparency and info on where the data came from or data processing decisions really helps users assess the quality of data sets for their specific use case. And data set experts also made the point that this type of documentation needs to be up to date and stored as living documents. And then a fourth driver that appeared is team science, where data experts mentioned that the people involved in data set creation is important for its subsequent data quality. And good teams can really help make decisions that enhance intrinsic and contextual elements of data set readiness, and also the trustworthiness of the data sets that are produced. And data set experts also noted that teams should also include patients and other data contributors to really guide data set creation. And the final driver here is incentivization. So there needs to be increased incentives for data set quality work. There were data experts who expressed they were limited by funding and resources to carry out what was necessary. Plus, also like professionally, some didn't feel valued for the work that they did. So for example, one expert said, I feel like in many ways I've kind of destroyed my career by spending too much time on cleaning data and sharing data. Genuinely, what?
I said that feels too real. There's much uncomfortable laughter in the room.
Oh, sorry. Genuinely, I think career-wise, it's not a good thing to do. People don't see data sets as research. So there's a question of, are you actually doing research? There's a lot of work involved in supporting data sets, and academia doesn't reward data sharing, sorry. And going beyond the data set experts, they also express that on an institutional level, incentives are not really aligned to facilitate the creation of more AI-ready data sets. So for example, another expert said, most of the other hospitals would rather sell the data than make it available for research, and a lot of them actually do. So you have the challenge of hospitals being money-making institutions in America, which is an incentive that is driving a different use of the data, not an altruistic one. But also the problem that it can be difficult to convince someone to take on non-zero risk on distributing patient data so the group benefits. So you can see that there's this type of back and forth thing happening. And this leads to the completion of our AI readiness framework. So overall, we just hope that this would be able, data set creators and other stakeholders can really consider some of these factors prior to data set creation so that you can help facilitate this health data ecosystem for it to be more modernized and an integrated one for machine learning research. And finally, some of the takeaways. No data set is perfect, but there are choices that data set creators and the field can make to move towards more AI-ready data sets. Focusing on multifaceted factors such as documentation, team science, data quality standards, data availability, and incentivization can enhance the creation of AI-ready data sets on a larger scale. And clear standards at the data set creation stage can really help with some things that are more downstream, AI model reporting at later stages of the AI lifecycle. And our study just hopes to bring to the forefront what matters most to those who are creating and using data sets for machine learning research and provide some of these recommendations or insights to help impact future practices. And finally, after the work for Module 1 and Module 2, we tackled Module 3, which was to catalog and categorize useful public data sets for machine learning research in a web repository. So we developed the AIMI dataset index, which Ala talked about, which currently has a small inventory of relevant data sets. So feel free to check that out with the QR code here, and just let us know if how we can make this resource more useful. And if possible, you can also provide some data set suggestions as well. So finally, I just want to take a moment to thank the incredible team for 2 years worth of awesome teamwork. So we had the core team, our expert advisory panel, and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and just also to AIMI and the Beamer community for being so generous and collaborative throughout this process. So thank you all for listening, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
With your questions, go ahead and jump in. Could you back up to your takeaway slide?
Oh yeah.
I'm going to challenge you a little bit.
Oh no.
The second takeaway: focusing on multiple things does not make sense. What does it mean to focus on? What is the thing we should do? And you can't have multiple answers.
What should we do?
Yeah.
I mean, you can always do. I can only choose one thing.
What should I focus on, and what does it mean to focus?
What does it mean to focus? I can't focus on multiple things. Okay, so maybe I didn't use the right word.
Definition.
At least not at the same time.
Sorry, what did you say?
At least not at the same time.
Not at the same time. Yeah, I think I meant if possible, consider these things. And if not, one of them is still better than none. Investing in teams, thinking about who makes up your teams, or people who are starting off in your lab. Why is it important for documentation? Like it's all tied together, right? It's all going to be relevant downstream for people who are developing models and using your data set. So there's just a cascade of consequences. And the earlier it can, we can invest in these things at the earlier stages of data set creation, it can only yield returns later on, I think. I don't know if that helps.
So I can imagine, you focus on why you allocate resources specifically. We're not going to figure it as we go. It's like we need to have a person who's going to spend 15% of the effort on making sure our documentation and feature set is well defined.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing you can decide to do. I don't feel like you can focus on incentivization. Like either I have an incentive or I don't. Right? Can I modify that? Or if there's not an incentive there, there's nothing I can do about it. I need to do what I'm incentivized to do.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. maybe I think when you said resources, allocating resources. So depending on where there might be a gap, where would you allocate resources to? That would help, create more, an equitable ecosystem later on.
Go ahead.
So go ahead. When I was involved with both of these projects in some form or fashion, my question to both of you is, did you learn anything you didn't know?
So what was it? Tell us the part that you did know.
Well, I guess,
What is the nugget that you didn't know before the study and that you now know after the study?
I guess
That's a
for
good
what
question.
it was not that we didn't know, we knew anecdotally, and it was just a way to put that evidence out, that this is what we know is like what people are saying within organizations. We didn't find anything in the literature that said that before, so this was the only thing that is formally going beyond, and just going beyond the component of regulation is a barrier, but why is it a barrier? It's just because reputation, money, and other things important that trumps that. So it just was a way to put that out, to say that, people are wrestling with other factors, and it's not really about data sharing or not data sharing, it's about their higher factors that you need, that dictates what behaviors you see. So I guess that's
This qualitative research is different. Natalie, you want to respond to that question too? What's something you learned here that you didn't already know before you started the work?
Oh yeah, I think what surprised me was like how much of the burden was on the data set creators and how much they were doing. There was a data set creator that was managing like this huge repository, and he just felt like he had like a responsibility towards everything. And I think that was surprising to me, but maybe not surprising to you guys. But you guys probably knew that before.
Yeah, so where I'm going with this is that I find this kind of conversation amongst researchers writ large. And people who have no control over the data. Like, we're all just talking amongst ourselves, oh, this is too hard, it costs too much money, data are bad. We need to create incentives, everybody should behave good, but they're not. I mean, it's like, but the root cause of this is that a health system doesn't view data as a capital asset. You never see an MRI machine in neglect. You never see an OR in neglect. But you do see data sets in neglect because they're not viewed as an asset or capital asset.
This is what industry is realizing.
But now, in order to fix that, do you think any CFO is going to read papers and get the memo that data is a capital asset? They don't even know what the Gordon Bailey Moore Foundation is. So it's like we're all academics talking in some echo chamber to each other about how the world is a bad place and we need to fix all the data sets. But the people who can change incentives are not even listening to that conversation.
So if I can ask a question, because I really agree, but what is the process that the things we know about are challenging for research? What practices can we do to kind of like sell it to CFOs and CEOs that data is an asset?
Make a business case that why cleaning data will lead to something better. Higher quality, more revenue, more patients, less work for your clinicians, nurses. There are 4 things they really care about. I mean, it's quality, is in Vision rankings and that kind of stuff, workforce satisfaction, outcomes, quality, workforce satisfaction, financial stability, 4 things. Most health systems care about these 4 things, in that order, roughly. Patient outcomes is first, quality is second, workforce is third.
It's on the list.
Of course, then we can make it as a circle or square or something, so it's like, But what are things we can tie to from those 4 things that every CFO, CEO, COO cares about?
I think I was surprised crossing paths by some of like, working on some of like the clinical trials data set within hospitals around, like teams requiring teams on the technical side to pull a lot of patient data. But really, what is the outcome you're trying, like, there isn't even a formulated research question about what is exactly patient outcome you're trying to measure. Like, what is it, is it decrease in mortality, is it the number of patients you're getting? Like, even that itself is not kind of clearly defined, which I don't know if that was just the case because of one case of N1, but I mean, in general, I think we need to have like, even if we want to say that AI is improving across, we need to have a definition of what is patient outcomes that we're comparing across different institutions. I don't think we do have that same definition even. So that's.
Let me pose a counterpoint. The problems we have in the clinical side that need solving, that would create differences in patient outcomes or workforce burden reduction or happiness or whatever. These are not the kinds of problems that are publishable if you solve the problem. And so like the tension here is, and we run into this all the time on the operations side, is we'd love to solve this XYZ problem. There's like a chasm, a technical chasm we need to like cross. Right, like I'm not gonna go like master some like library or something, right? So we need people to jump into that technical chasm that will donate their time and effort, that will not advance their careers.
So, but that's a problem that is within our purview. We, as a research community, get to pick what's publishable or not. We publish the wrong things and then complain about data. And just think about it, right? I mean, it is within our control as a research community to prioritize what we consider valuable to publish. But we value one thing and then complain about another.
Yeah, that cutting edge work, it does not translate into operational outcomes. Our problems are much more pedantic than.
And I guess to many in the research world, like we do the research, but we really are not aware that actually the models we're building might not even translate very well because they don't map to the operational problem. Like when we are developing and solving research problem, we never think of or at least what I have seen is that operations is not in the purview of what we're thinking about. We think after we build something, we're handing it and then it's going to translate. So it just makes sense.
An observation and a question. The observation is that your presentation today kind of mushed over whether we're talking about data sets that are collected as part of clinical trials or experiments versus routinely collected data that we might want to use for some sort of analysis. And what bothers me is that we know that for most experimental data, there are federal mandates that those data have to be shared. Whereas for routinely collected patient data, there's no such mandate. And it would seem really important in your study to be able to clarify whether we're talking about one or the other.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point, and I did not include that, but in the definitions. But one of the key components was just looking at clinical data that's used for patient clinical care. So this did not include.
Yeah, but clinical trial data, clinical.
No, we did not. We did not look. We specifically did not look at clinical trials. So I think we're stemming off a paper that was published by Dr. Kurt Langlod, Snigam Shah, and David Larson about ethics of data sharing. And one of the components there was how once data clinical use is fulfilled, the secondary use of data is part of the ethical component of promoting science. And then we wanted to look at how that secondary use of clinical data is being used as part of the data that's for routine care. But I did not define this earlier, but that's the scope. That's a very good question.
The question is about three or 4 years ago, there was a very big study that was done by the National Academies looking at attitudinal barriers to data sharing. And they were looking specifically at experimental data as opposed to routinely collected clinical data. But I'm wondering whether you had a chance to look at the results of that study and whether you think whether your work actually builds on that or shows differences from what that study did.
I think I would be interested to go back and reflect and see what that is. And
you really should. It was a very big deal.
Yeah.
So, Mark, if I may, so you were saying for routinely collected data, like EHR data, that is not readily available?
Sure. Say it again.
I think
so your question is, your question is that for routinely collected data, like clinical data, that's not always available, but for some of these data sets, like All of Us and UK Biobank, I believe like they do get some clinical data, like the routinely collected data. So
I would view this as clinical. They're not. Yeah, you view those kind of observational studies on patients who are obviously consented to have their data made available. That's different from Stanford Healthcare making my data available because they actually have access to it and can use it. That might be. So I think we have to make a distinction between data that are routinely collected as part of observational work versus data that are routinely collected as a consequence of healthcare.
Great. We're wrapping up to just the last minute here. Maybe Madalena, do you want to have a final thought or comment about where you think this goes to next, and we'll have a lot, and we'll wrap up. But Madalena, why don't you go ahead with the final thought?
Final thoughts? Oh yeah. Well, thank you for coming to the talk. I really hope that this framework would be helpful for your work and open to collaboration. So feel free to reach out.
Great. And Alaa, where are we going to next? What happens now?
I guess, like there's no translation to that, but I guess it's revisiting exactly where's the problem and what really we need to publish on with respect to governance and organizations, but also trying to bridge the gap between research and operations and what are the selling points that our research should be about in order to convince that, clinical data sharing is important.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much again for being here. See everybody next week.